Hello and welcome to today's episode of DIBCAC Talk. Today's episode is very special because I got to interview a representative from the DCMA. DCMA is the Defense Contract Management Agency, and the official is Mr. John Ellis. Mr. Ellis is currently the Software Division Director, and he's responsible for the training, policy, and tools used by the agency's software professionals. Join me as I chat with Mr. Ellis to learn more about DCMA, to learn more about the DOD assessment methodology, and to understand how DCMA plays in the CMMC ecosystem. I'm Leslie Weinstein, and this is DIBCAC Talk, a show where we make sense of all things cybersecurity for the defense industrial base. In this series, I'll introduce you to cybersecurity concepts and industry experts. I'll also review innovative products and solutions to help you implement and manage your cybersecurity program. Let's dig right in. Thank you so much, Mr. Ellis, for joining me here today on DIBCAC Talk. Before we get started, I want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and about the organization that you work for.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm John Ellis. I'm DCMA's director for the software division, where I'm responsible for software and cybersecurity policy as it relates to defense contracts throughout the Department of Defense. DCMA provides contract administration services to the Department of Defense, other federal agencies, and international partners, and is really an essential part of the acquisition process from pre-award all the way through sustainment. A couple quick factoids. Each business day, DCMA receives nearly 1,000 new contracts and authorizes more than $650 million in payments to contractors.
Every day?
Every day.
Every day. Wow.
Every day. More importantly, across all of those contract actions, we deliver approximately 1.5 million items from fighter jets to fasteners to the war fighters. So pretty monumental task if you think about the size of the defense industrial base and all the things that the department purchases. A large portion of that is managed by DCMA.
Awesome. Okay, so DCMA, I don't know, got famous or is known for conducting DOD high assessments, these using the same methodology that's referenced in the new interim rule that introduced the CMMC. Can you walk us through what a DIBCAC assessment is, or what it should be called, or how we should be thinking about it, and kind of walk us through what the process is, because this interim rule identifies, I think, 81 expected to be conducted each year going forward. So for those 81 lucky companies, what can they expect in this process?
Okay, so to understand that, we need to have go through a little history. So back in February of 2019, Ms. Lord signed out a memo. And oh, by the way, that memo is cited in the Federal Register. That's really what launched this discussion that we're having today. And she directed the department and really DCMA to begin conducting strategic assessments of the 7012 clause, which is the protecting. I can't even talk. Let me start over. So in February 2019, Ms. Lord at ANS directed that the Department of Defense begin conducting strategic assessments. DCMA was given that lead responsibility to put together an assessment methodology that was led originally by the OSD CIO. That methodology is what is now referred to as a DIBCAC assessment. That's the synonymous term. The DOD assessment is truly what it is, because not only does the DIBCAC conduct assessments, but the other services and agencies do as well. So it's not a unique thing that only DCMA does.
So what does DIBCAC stand for? What does the acronym DIBCAC stand for?
DIBCAC stands for the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, and that's a mouthful.
Yes. Okay.
So
cool. I don't think I ever actually knew what that term meant. So thank you.
Yeah, believe me, when we are the government and we love our acronyms, so we had to come up with something really clever, and there you go. So the DIBCAC was directed to stand up in what a lot of people don't know. That organization literally went from non-existent to in place in about a 90-day period. And that was a monumental feat. You know, the government typically doesn't move that fast. But at the end of the day, we brought in an initial team of folks that were incredibly well qualified. And we had great engagement from the defense industrial base companies as well. So in June of last year, June of 2019, we began conducting pilot assessments, primarily with the larger defense industrial base companies. A lot of folks refer to this term, the Big Six. We went to see those guys first because they had the most robust capabilities in place. They had a lot of expertise, and quite honestly, they were helping us to refine what would eventually become the process that we're using today. So as everyone knows and probably understands, you know, you start out with what you think a process should look like. And then once you get into it, you realize that some things don't work as well as you thought they would. You have to make some adjustments, and this is no different. We conducted initially 16 pilot assessments through the end of fiscal year 19. And then we literally just overnight declared ourselves to have our initial operational capability, a term known as IOC. Yeah. And the DIBCAC was officially, you know, formed at that point, and we've been conducting assessments ever since. This year,
are you guys now FOC?
Yeah, well, FOC is our IOC, but that's a discussion for another day. But at the end of fiscal year 20, we had conducted approximately 108 assessments, and we continue to perform those assessments today. During the most recent COVID impacted operations, we had to figure out a way to conduct the high confidence assessments without actually going to facilities. So we came up with a virtual assessment methodology. That virtual assessment methodology focuses on all of the requirements with the exception of those that you physically must be present to close out. And it sort of becomes a two-step assessment process. So let me back up and talk about the coordination required to conduct a high confidence assessment.
Yeah, well, first of all, how do you guys alert companies to the fact that they have to undergo this? I think there was some misperceptions on LinkedIn that people were thinking that you could just schedule an assessment, like call you guys up and say, hey, come check me out. But how does that work? Do you guys poke somebody and tell them, like, lucky you, you're next?
That's exactly what we do. So what we do is we apply some DOD priorities. You know, we look at companies of interest, you know, things that not all things are created equally. I think we all understand that. So some programs, some technologies, some capabilities would have higher interest than others. So we tend to focus on those sorts of companies. We also look at, you know, particular threats and what's going on within the cyber realm to potentially look at companies that we may have you know, those other interests in. So at the end of the day, we reach out to the company and begin the coordination process no earlier than 30 days in advance. So we don't give a whole lot of headway, but you know, you got a good month, if not more, to conduct that pre-coordination where we talk about the documentation that's going to be needed. We walk through the process. We explain what we'll need when we show up. And then there may be some intermediate discussions between the initial contact and the actual assessment team showing up on your doorstep.
Okay, so do you like ask for their policies and documentation? Do you review those beforehand amongst yourselves, or do you guys just review it to make sure that they have it, but then like the real assessment and the real digging through, does that happen on site? Like, let's just pretend COVID's not a factor right now and you guys are still going on site. How does that work? Is there any, I guess, questions beforehand, like you've gotten their policies and you think that maybe they're not sufficient, or you have a lot of questions? Do you engage them before you show up on site, or do you save all of those questions for when you guys roll up, you know, with how many people show up on site?
So using the pre-COVID model, under the pre-COVID model. It's hard to imagine we have to talk about things in pre-COVID and post-COVID these days, but so in the pre-COVID model, all the documentation is prepared and handled at the company itself. There's very little documentation gets shared prior to us showing up, because quite honestly, a lot of that information, particularly the system security plan, can be very sensitive, and we do not, on the government side nor the company side, we don't want that information to escape into the wild, just to be blunt. So typically what happens is all of that information is made available to the assessment team on the day the assessment team shows up, and they spend most of that morning going through the documentation. Now, a word of advice to those listening that may see a future assessment on their calendar: we look at the documentation you provide us, every bit of it, to include your system security plan. I've been on assessments, while I don't conduct them, go out on them now, but I was part of the early, the pilot phase operations, where companies did not know where something was in their own policy, but we did, and we helped point them to their policy. And sometimes they weren't quite sure about a response, and we would help them with that. Something to be well understood: our assessment is not a gotcha exercise at all. We would really prefer that a company be fully implementing all 110 requirements as defined by 800-171. That tells us that company has made the investment to protect the information that we're interested in. We don't grade on style. We don't necessarily have to like the way that a company does something. As long as it meets the requirements, it meets the requirements. So it's a go, no-go sort of activity. The grading criteria is very well understood, and we explain all that. So what the scoring, the points align to. If you read the assessment methodology itself, it's a weighted scoring mechanism where those requirements deemed most important carry more weight than others. And yes, you can actually get a negative score, which seems, sort of counterintuitive, but it's just the way the weighted mechanism works. But at the end of the day, we truly want companies to be fully compliant, because that tells us that our information contained in those networks and systems are likely okay. And that's really what we're talking about here, a level of confidence that the information is secure.
Okay, so I was talking with somebody just yesterday, and they helped one of their clients go through a DIBCAC assessment, and there was a discrepancy between what the people who showed up on site, they were briefing the assessment methodology, and there was a word variation between the word and or. NIST 800-171 says and the briefing documentation said or. So knowing that this client was actually lacking in that control, they were trying to argue that, oh, well, your briefing slide says or, the client picked or, and ultimately they lost that argument. So what is the definitive source? Like, if there is this type of discrepancy, what is the definitive source to prove the language? It's probably not the briefer's slide, right? It's probably NIST 800-171. And what if there's an off chance that the DOD methodology slightly varies in verbiage from NIST 800-171? So what is the definitive source that people should be referencing?
So think of the documents I'm about to describe almost like one of those little Russian nested dolls. Mm-hmm. So you have the DOD assessment methodology, which really describes the scoring mechanism. The requirements themselves are described in 800-171. How they're to be assessed and the definitive source for how the assessment criteria will be applied is in the 800-171 alpha, the assessment guide. Now, there is yet another resource for small businesses in particular that can help provide some context to what that level of detail that's in the 800-171 alpha. And that is, and I actually have it on my other screen over here, that is the NIST MEP Mike Echo Papa Cybersecurity Self-Assessment Handbook for assessing NIST SP 800-171. It's NIST Handbook 162. a great resource. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, it's really good for that too. But at the end of the day, there are definitive sources that lays out the criteria for each one of those. It is also important to understand that a high confidence assessment is not a PowerPoint drill. Yes, you'll have an introduction. Yes, there'll be some descriptions of network architectures and sort of the notional how a company organizes its deck chairs, so to speak. But each one of the requirements, the methodology for how the assessment will be conducted is actually laid out in the 171 Alpha, and it is a show me exercise. Every one of those requirements will be verified through the appropriate level and type of inspection process as defined by the 171 Alpha. It is not a here's my PowerPoint briefing drill. This is a go through them all. It's also important to note that nobody from DCMA, or if the services and agencies are conducting one of these assessments, no government person is quote unquote touching a contractor system. All of that is over the shoulder. It is all witnessed by the government personnel. At no time do we touch systems. So there's no pen testing. There's no scanning of any sort. There's none of our guys operating keyboards, and monkeying around where we shouldn't be. It is a matter of, hey, company, show us what you're doing, show us how you're doing it, show us how you're documenting things. And all that is supposed to tie back to the system security plan. An assessment can take as fast, and we've seen assessments happen in as fast as 2 days.
Wow.
On site. We've also seen them go 5 days. The difference being how well is the company prepared, how much homework have they done in advance? Have they actually sort of walked through and understood where all of their policies are, who the right people to talk to are? We've seen small companies do very, very well. We've seen small companies not do so well. We've seen big companies do really, really well, and the other side as well.
Yeah,
So
speaking of the right
universal.
person, so these small companies who don't have in-house cybersecurity talent, let alone IT talent, and they outsource some of their IT and cybersecurity services, are those people allowed to participate in the assessment because they are providing, some coverage for the SSP? As long as it's properly annotated in the SSP that these are the cybersecurity professionals, are they allowed to participate with the company?
Absolutely. So whoever the company needs to be part of the assessment, because it's their network, it's their system. So we expect to see those personnel involved in the execution of the assessment itself, because that's who is providing that advice, that capability to the company. At the end of the day, however, it is important to understand if there is a discrepancy, if there is an issue, we do hold the company itself, that the prime contractor, if you will, responsible, not necessarily who provides their help desk services or provides that IT support.
Right. That's fantastic. So this sounds like the process of the DCMA assessment that you guys have been doing for a couple of years sounds eerily similar to what the CMMC is promising will happen, but being conducted by independent third parties. To what extent can you talk about DCMA's involvement in the CMMC process, whether it be on the policy backend, helping steer the CMMC PMO, or potentially helping train C3PAOs, or how much or how little can you tell us about your involvement in that process?
So DCMA has been involved in the establishment of the CMMC literally from its infancy and continues to date. So almost consider it an evolution going from the DOD standard assessment methodology and it morphing and becoming eventually what is going to be known as CMMC. It's a continuum. So DCMA has been involved since the very beginning, and DCMA will be involved after CMMC is fully in place and phased in over the 5-year period. So as you guys can probably imagine, CMMC is still in some sausage making mode now of laying out what training is going to look like.
Did your power go out?
I believe the power just went out. Hang on just a second.
That's so weird because you have internet. There we go.
Part of the building is has backup power and part of it doesn't. And you obviously see that the lights
It's funny.
is not part of that. We're okay now.
We can start from the beginning here. I'll cut that whole part out. Thank you.
The blooper reel is worth its weight in gold. Okay. So DCMA has been part of CMMC since its infancy and will continue to be as we go into the future. We're going through a sausage making mode now, if you will, to define training requirements and certification processes, how we will adjudicate when there are issues across the board. But DCMA is very, very, very much involved with CMMC as we took those lessons learned going through the DOD assessment methodology and really trying not to have to relearn those lessons on the CMMC side. But for all intents and purposes, folks should continue at a continuum. And there will be a transition point somewhere in the future where DCMA-led or service and agency-led DOD standard assessments will flip and we'll stop doing those assessments coming along. The third-party assessment organizations, it is not to. No one should think that the government may not show up on their doorstep in the future, because quite honestly, we do have vested interest in some things, and we may have some concerns that would fall outside of the awareness of the CMMC side of things. And it's important to understand that this is a team sport, and we all have an interest in making sure that information is secure. So don't assume that CMMC makes the government go away. The government's still there. They're part of the process.
So, is there going to be any reciprocity between a government high assessment and the CMMC, at least for the next 5 years? Because the interim rule says that a high assessment costs industry about $50,000, which is more than a CMMC level 3 assessment. So, so if somebody has, a high level assessment, say next year, and then an RFP pops up that they want to bid on that requires a CMMC level 3, does that offer some sort of level of reciprocity?
Yeah, so there is some reciprocity rules that are being worked out as part of the CMMC process. And so there is rough equivalency between the current DOD assessment methodology and CMMC level 3. That's the level required to handle a controlled unclassified information. So they're roughly equivalent. If you think about it, it's the same 800-171 requirement at the core of both of them. On the CMMC side, you have some additional process and maturity oriented requirements in addition to 800-171. So the reciprocity rules are actually going to go both ways while we have both in place. So for example, if DCMA has already conducted an assessment of a company and they did well, because quite honestly, if they're scoring negative numbers, they probably need a full assessment to see where they're at anyway. But if they did well, and we're working through what the well is defined as,
Right.
If they did well, we'll focus and sort of do a delta assessment, only focus on those additional requirements that CMMC brought to the table. We'll also use the same methodology the other way. If a company is one of the pilot CMMC companies, and it's going to be phased in over a 5-year period, so selected contracts and companies will pick up that requirement. If it's a DOD interest company, then we would not necessarily conduct an assessment of them. We would use the CMMC assessment.
So do you know
it goes both ways?
So speaking of the CMMC having, I think it has 20 extra controls that the NIST 800-171 doesn't have. And so those additional 20 controls and then the policy and procedural and resource documentation requirements for the level 3, we don't have an assessment guide for those, but yet provisional assessors are being trained currently. So when will industry have the opportunity to see those assessment requirements that they will, in theory, next year be judged against with at least the provisional assessors?
I can't give you an exact date. I know those assessment guides are being developed, and they'll be published and made available through the CMMC AB.org site whenever they're available.
Okay. And what about like the policy? So the CMMC appendices, when it talks about the .999, .998, and .997, it offers like guidance, but it doesn't have like a really explicit like thou shalt have 17 different policies or you should have 50 policies. What advice can you offer to companies who are looking at trying to get some policies in place because maybe they've had procedures in place or they do what they're supposed to, but they just haven't documented? When you're thinking about policy and creating a policy for a company, for like, say, a small business, where should they start and how should they think about writing their policies?
Well, what I would advise a company on, and this is a sort of a universal foot stomp, I'm gonna say, how do you get ready now is actually how you get ready for CMMC.
Mm-hmm.
So how you get ready now to do what you just asked me about is a company should start with NIST 800-171 and take a look at it and understand, the families of requirements and the gist of what is there. So you really need policies to address each one of those areas. For those that have not looked at 800-171, it is basically the basic block and tackling sort of activities that you would hope that any company is performing to protect its own intellectual property, let alone the government's information within those networks. I mean, we all know the bad guys are sniffing around 24/7, 365. So the basic protections as outlined by 800-171 are just common sense, do these sorts of things, activities. So you need policies to address all of those things and how you do it, whether it's a compendium of multiple policies or it's a single policy with multiple appendices. Once again, it goes back to what I said earlier. We don't grade on style, we grade on content. Do you actually do the things that you say you're doing? Have you actually documented the processes? As you develop your system security plan, you can actually help yourself ensure you have those proper policies documented in how you conduct business. So use this as sort of a forcing function to make sure you've covered all your bases. It's a pretty comprehensive requirement. That requirement is the core of what happens under CMMC. It's the same set of core requirements. Those CMMC additional requirements are more process and maturity oriented. Are you doing things to stay current? Are you doing things to continuously improve? If you're familiar with any of the capability maturity models, those are built on, once you get to a certain level of competence, if you will, that maturity process, it then goes into levels of what do you do to improve upon that? Do you have quantitative or qualitative measures in place? So think of CMMC in a similar context. So I've got my core requirements, and then how do I maintain that currency, if you will? And that's really the focus of those additional processes that get added to the 800-171 requirements.
So kind of going back a little bit to previous part of our conversation, the 171 clause, the clause that goes into contracts that handle and process CUI, is it true that DOD puts the 7012 clause into all contracts and that DCMA was instrumental in modifying some contracts a few years ago to get that clause put in?
So 7012 clause, the 252, 204, 7012, everybody just calls it the 7012 clause. The 7012 clause is a mandatory contract clause for all contracts with the exception of pure COTS. CMMC is actually going to follow a very similar model. So if you look at the wording in the Federal Register, it says, CMMC applies to everything except for pure COTS. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. And those below the micro purchase thresholds. So, if I'm buying boxes of thumbtacks, I'm probably not worried about CMMC. But 7012 is a mandatory clause, and yes, DCMA did help a couple of years ago with some block changes, if you will, or mass modifications to add those on a number of contracts. But that was primarily just because as it was a new requirement, it just didn't get picked up everywhere like it should have. It wasn't anything, there was no nefarious intent, nothing strange. It was just, you bring something new along, you gotta catch up and clean up the battle space.
That makes sense. But my concern is with the interim rule, it talks about that only the people who have the DFAR 7012 clause in their contract, those are the ones who have to self-assess and report their score of NIST 800-171. But the DFARS clause sounds like it exists in contracts that don't necessarily have CUI. So is this, how do we help industry that may be freaking out because they don't know if they have CUI, and they look and see that they have the 7012 clause and they think that they have CUI because the clause is in there. So now they're freaking out thinking, oh my gosh, we have to implement NIST 800-171 when it's not true because they don't have CUI. So how can we help inform and educate, I guess, the industry? Because I feel like this is going to be a shock to the system when they hear this.
So keep in mind that the 7012 clause, it's not new. So 7012 has been around since 2013.
Right.
The current version has been around since 2017. At the end of the day, it is, like I said, it's a mandatory requirement. It's in practically every contract out there. We're talking, well in excess of 1 million contracts. Tens of thousands, if not more, companies have this in existing contracts. And I would say, from a company perspective, go look at your contracts to see if it's in there now. If you're not sure if you have CUI, go talk to your customers, go talk to the PMs, go talk to the contracting officers that you work with, and ask for that clarity. For example, if you're handling a tech data package, you're handling CUI in most cases. If you have marked anything other than public release of information in terms of documentation, you probably have some flavor of CUI in your contracts. CUI is not necessarily an evil thing or bad thing. It's that information that needs to be protected. The other thing is, if you've got CUI on one contract, unless you completely separate and segregate that one contract from everything else in your network, chances are it's polluting, if you will, your overall network. So that's one of the reasons why we conduct enterprise level or those strategic assessments, and not necessarily looking at individual contract actions. We look at, what's the environment that a company uses to house multiple contracts. I'll give you a case in point. One of the pilot companies, way back when we started that process, asked a question of what's in it for them. What's in it for them to allow DCMA to come in and conduct a pilot assessment? And, of course, we talked about, you guys are really smart. You can help us make this a better process. I said, but there is something that's in it for you. You can either let us come in and do one assessment for all of the contracts that you manage for the department, and I asked the question, how many contracts do you have? And they said, well, about 8,000. I said, or I can come back 8,000 times and look at each individual contract action. What's more beneficial to you? Because I can tell you what's more beneficial to us on the government side is to come see you once and make sure, because of the way your enterprise is defined, we have a confidence that it does what it needs to do. And it made common sense, it made all the sense in the world that the assessment went extraordinarily well in the company. We've actually learned a lot from the company in that regard. But at the end of the day, if you've got one contract, you really, unless you have taken the extraordinary steps to completely separate that potentially in its own enclave or separate it out in some other fashion, and we've seen interesting things like CUI and offline, remote storage devices and only connected when needed. We've seen some interesting things, but at the end of the day, it's your network, it's your systems, and we expect you to protect our information that's contained therein. And if you're not sure what needs to be protected, talk to your contracting officers and your PMs on the government side to come to that clarity.
So I just have one more question before I let you go. Will there be a provision to sunset NIST 800-171 as a requirement as the CMMC comes out? Because right now, like advising clients, initially they'll contact me or other people in this industry and say, help me with CMMC. And I always say, well, let's start with NIST 800-171 because it's an existing requirement and it's an enduring requirement, at least for the next 5 years until the CMMC comes online. So is the plan to sunset NIST or to keep it going a little bit further past the 5 years after the CMMC becomes a thing? for everybody?
So I think the real question is in reference to what's going to happen with the 7012 clause, because the NIST requirement stays the same between current methodology and CMMC methodology.
Good point.
So 800-171 will just evolve as the requirements evolve, like any of those standards do. So put that aside.
So are you saying that, just point of clarification, this was a question I totally forgot to ask, but it's a good question. So is the CMMC pegged to NIST 800-171 so that if NIST 800-171 gets a Rev 3, do the controls within CMMC automatically update as well?
So to say automatically may not be quite the way, you would have to update the methodology, and depend on the degree of change, and your assessments could change as well. While we haven't really talked about levels 4 and 5, there's work yet to be done there, because a lot of those technical requirements are tied to what's referred to as NIST SP 800-172, which will be published in the not too distant future, and that deals with higher levels of requirements for particular programs and technology. So if you get a new requirement, typically there'll be a phase in, phase out process that occurs over time, and that just has to be managed. There's no one size fits all answer to that.
But we can expect to see change if they do modify 171. Then we would expect to see a modification at some point in the near future before the CMMC. Okay.
Yes. Now, keep in mind, if you go look at what's in the Federal Register, it does talk about changes that will be made to the 7012 clause to include CMMC. So that's where you're going to see the change. The other requirements, the 7012 clause has other requirements to include reporting, reportable incidents when those sorts of things occur, saving media for if the government requested that sort of thing. So there's more requirements than just the 800-171 piece, and those things are just going to evolve to include CMMC. So if folks really want to enjoy the light reading that is the Federal Register, multiple pages of documents, was it 30? I actually have it here somewhere, 30 some pages. By all means, go read it. And it'll help lay out some of this. It may also generate some questions. It also tells you if you have questions, comments, or inputs right in the very beginning of the register, you can send those questions to OSD for consideration. To give your inputs and ask for that clarity, ask for inputs, and help us make it a better plan and better rules that gets published.
Absolutely. So before we leave, I want to give you the opportunity to give any last bit of advice or to talk about anything that we haven't covered that you think is relevant and important and you want everybody to know.
Absolutely. So one, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to meet with us and in helping get the message out to folks. On the CMMC side of things, there is a body of professionals, both government and industry, that have been working on this for quite some time, and I will tell you, it's been a monumental effort to try to get it right. And like anything else, we'll get something going and we'll make adjustments and make it better going forward. But those folks really deserve a huge attaboy for the amount of work that's been put into this. It is critically important that we protect information. I think we all know that. So some people have asked, why doesn't the DIBCAC just do all this? Unless I had unlimited resources and humanoids, there is no way I can go out and look at 300,000 plus companies in any sort of a meaningful way. So we had to come up with a methodology that really required that the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, had skin in the game, and the CMMC helps to achieve that. At the end of the day, though, it's the same basic requirements at the center of both of these methodologies. And I can't stress enough, if you want to get ready for CMMC, do the things you're supposed to be doing now. And that includes full implementation of 800-171. Notice I added a word in front of 800-171, full implementation. Today, you can have a system security plan and you can have POAMs, get well plans, if you will, for things not fully implemented. And you're still compliant with the clause requirement, but you do have some risk injected into your network environment because you haven't fully implemented all the requirements. That's fine for today. Under CMMC, there are no POAMs allowed and no waivers. So you must meet all of the requirements. So do your homework now, get it right, get comfortable with it, stay abreast of what's going on with the CMMCAB.org website so you can see that information as it continues to come out. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Though many companies out there do business with DCMA or with other government agencies and the services, ask them about what's going on, stay informed, but listen, if you want to be successful, do the things that you're signed up for today, that's in your contracts today. I can't say that today part often enough. You're supposed to be compliant now, go do it. And with that, you will be successful with CMMC in the future.
Well, I think that is fantastic advice. Sounds like common sense, but you never know. Some people need to hear it foot stomped and said again. So, Mr. Ellis, thank you so much for your time today and joining us on the show. I know everyone hopefully enjoyed your talk and your insight into what you guys have been doing. So thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. If you ever need any help, just let us know.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you again for tuning in to today's episode of DIBTech Talk. I hope you learned as much from Mr. Ellis as I did. Before we go, I want to clear the air on a few things regarding the CMMC interim rule. First of all, the CMMC interim rule does go into effect on 30 November. However, there is no 30 November deadline for anything. DOD would never issue a rule or a law and hardly would ever issue an internal memo that would have a 60-day turnaround requirement for reporting, especially not one that impacts so many companies outside of the department. So the interim rule deadline that I'm talking about is this 30 November for self-reporting your NIST 800-171 score. If you reference your handy copy of the interim rule, you will see that this rule introduces the 7019 clause, the DFARS clause 7019. That is the requirement to self-report your NIST 800-171 self-assessment score into SPRS. Now, there are some primes who are leaning down on their suppliers, asking for the suppliers to submit their score to the primes. That is not what I'm talking about. That is their own prerogative. In fact, the interim rule says that primes should not be working with companies who have not conducted a self-assessment. So they are doing their due diligence to making sure that their supply chain is doing what is required. However, reporting that score to DOD, it's not triggered by the 30 November implementation date of this interim rule. You will only be required to submit the score into SPRS for verification by a contracting officer if you are bidding on an RFP that contains not only the DFARS 7012 clause, which is the current existing DFARS clause to become NIST 800-171 compliant, but it also must have the 7019 clause. Only RFPs and contracts that contain this clause are required to submit that self-assessment score because your contracting officer will be verifying that score in SPRS before they make an award decision. So that is the triggering mechanism for reporting this score. It's not the 30 November implementation date. It's not anything else. So I just want everyone to have that bit of knowledge so that they are not scared by any salesman who contacts them to tell them that they need to report to DOD by 30 November or 1 January or 5 November. The self-reporting is triggered by the DFARS clause in new contracts starting as early as 1 December. And the interim rule actually says that only 1/3 of RFPs would be impacted in this first year, with another 1/3 impacted in the second year, and the final third impacted in the third year. So I just want to make sure you guys have all the truth. Thanks again for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. And that wraps our episode for today. If you have any comments or questions, you can email me at leslie@dibtechtalk.com.